Greetings, this is Greg. I'm going to show you how I installed a boost gauge in a 2015 Maserati Ghibli Q4S. This is not to say that it's the only way to install such a boost gauge, but it's the way I did it. I installed the Vaitrix boost gauge, so commercial alert, I am financially tied to that because I do tech support for Eurocompulsion and they do sell that gauge. But I use this gauge on all my cars, and Eurocompulsion carries a lot of gauges, and it's the one I choose to use. Anyhow, let's get right to it. The gauge, this particular one, requires a boost sensor. That's this sensor here. The Maserati conveniently has a factory spot that fits the Vaitrix bracket. That's just dumb luck, but it's kind of nice. So then for a source of boost, I tapped into this port here. I removed the factory hose that connected this and put the silicone hoses in with a T, and I connect that, as you can see, to the boost sensor. Now, there are other Vaitrix options that do not require the boost sensor, thus won't require the hoses. We'll talk about that towards the end of the video. This is what I chose to use on my personal car in this case. So the sensor has a wiring loom that comes off of it. It's effectively one wire. It's several wires inside, but for our purposes of installation, it's one wire. And then that wire runs to a point under the cowling, and we'll discuss that in more detail in just a moment. The only other underhood wire is for ignition power. We need something to give it power when ignition is on, but not when ignition is off. For that purpose, I used this add-a-fuse device here and put it in this slot in the fuse box. On the 2015 Ghibli Q4S, that was the perfect spot to take power. If you have a different year or different car or whatever, you may have to find a different fuse. But in any case, that one works beautifully on this car. And I filed a little slot, you can see it there by my thumb, in the plastic cover so that the yellow wire is unobstructed as it runs through the side of the box. So the yellow wire, which takes ignition power, runs along here where it joins up with that black wire that we talked about that comes off of the boost sensor. The next thing we need to do is get those two wires through the firewall into the passenger cabin, which is probably the hardest part of this whole thing, but it's not terrible. What you want to do is find this cable here. This is the hood release cable, and it of course passes through the firewall. So to get access to it, you need to remove the windshield wipers. These pop off and there's a nut and those come right off. And there are some pins that enable you to lift this plastic up enough to get your arm in there and work. You don't have to take the whole thing off, you just need to create some space. Once you've created some space, and I know you can't see it, but there's a grommet down there in the firewall where the hood release passes through. You can remove that grommet by cutting it and then pull it out, enlarge the hole, and put the wires through and slip the grommet back in. It's not a terrible job to get that done. Now, from the inside of the car, and let's come around here, there's a panel here. This pops out very, very easily with a plastic pry tool. I popped that out. The clips are high quality enough that they don't just break. It's a nice deal. Then by reaching under the dash, I can, and looking under the dash, I can see light coming through where I removed the grommet. I removed the grommet from this side, but in any case, you can easily see the hole from under the car, and then I use a coat hanger, stick it through the hole, tape the wires to it on the other side, pull the wires through and up into this section here, and from there, the wires, the ignition wire will leave in here for a moment, and the wire from the boost sensor will run up here, and you can see I'm running it around here, and it connects to the back of the gauge. The gauge is the Vaitrix, as we talked about, non-plug-and-play 30 psi gauge. You could mount it a lot of different ways. I just used the included mount and double-sided sticky taped it to there, but I understand that you may want a cleaner look and have a form-fitting A-pillar pod or some other way of installing it. I've seen a lot of different clever things, but anyway, this is the way I did it. So that wire from the boost sensor just runs up here and plugs into the back of the gauge. Now, the other wire you can see that goes to the back of the gauge provides ignition power, battery power so that the gauge retains its memory when the car is shut off, and ground. These are very easy to do. Those three wires connect to three things, and I'll tell you where to connect them. The ignition power wire, which at the time of this video is yellow, connects to the yellow wire that I just brought up from the engine compartment. The red wire and the black wire, I simply posi-tapped those in to the back of the OBD2 port. The OBD2 port has battery power all the time, and it also has a ground all the time. So I didn't need to fish around under the car and look for battery power, look for ground, although they're not impossible to find in this car. Just for the sake of doing it the same way I can do it on any car, I tapped into the OBD2 port, and that worked perfectly. The OBD2 port, of course, is down under here like in every car sold in the United States. I went with a 30 PSI gauge because the Maserati engine is in a very lazy state of tune from the factory. I don't know if there's any more politically correct way to say it than that. Let's say it's not a highly stressed motor. It only runs maybe 12 pounds of boost, maybe a little bit more at some point in the RPM range when you're in sport mode. But generally speaking, it's a fairly low boost motor by Italian car standards, okay? I mean, not that 12 pounds is nothing, but compared to every other Italian car I've worked on, yeah, it's nothing. The boost gauge comes with a warning. The pointer flashes, a red light comes on, and it makes a really loud tone when you overboost. That overboost warning by default is set to 15 PSI. You can set it anywhere you want on the gauge, but 15, the default setting, actually works really, really well because, like I say, it just doesn't really go above 12 anyway. You can also set the ambient lighting. You don't need to connect it to the dashboard lights. The gauge has a built-in sensor, and it senses ambient lighting and will adjust bright and dim automatically. I just leave it in that mode, although it does have a wire to connect it to the dash lights if for some reason you wanted to do it, but I'm just telling you it's not necessary. And also, it has a little remote control that enables you to perform certain functions, and one of those is, of course, adjust the brightness or dimness of the display. So to recap, installation pretty simple. I installed the boost sensor, teed it in to the hose I showed you, ran ignition power from the fuse box using add a fuse up through the cowling where the cable for the hood release goes through, and brought it up through the side of the car, which is in the side of the dash rather, which is an easy spot, and brought the wires up to the gauge. Again, you may want to do it differently. This is just how I did it, and I think it works really well. I'll shut the camera off, but I'm going to continue the video and show you some of the options for this gauge. You may want the plug-and-play gauge or have some reason to go with a different one. These are the Vaitrix Gen2 boost gauges. These are the only boost gauges I use in my own cars. They're available in either 30 PSI or 45 PSI, and if you love the metric system, you can have those readings in bar, either 2 bar of boost or 3 bar of boost. I went with the 30 PSI non-plug-and-play gauge on the Maserati. As an example, I use the 45 PSI, also non-plug-and-play, I'll explain why in a minute, on my Fiat 124. But in the case of my 124, that car can run over 30 PSI, so I needed to go with the 45 PSI gauge. Let's take a look here. This is a plug-and-play gauge, and the wire carrying the boost sensor, carrying the boost signal, I should say, coming off of the boost gauge, connects directly to the car's boost sensor. That's why they call it, quote, plug-and-play, unquote. One connector connects to the factory boost sensor on the intake manifold, and the other connector connects to the plug on the car's wiring harness that was just plugged into the factory boost sensor. Of course, you unplugged it to hook this up. So it's very, very easy to hook up in terms of the boost sensor signal. Of course, you still need to provide power to the gauge via hot power, ignition power, and ground, as we discussed earlier, and we did on this car. The advantage of plug and play is, well, there are several advantages. One, it's very accurate because you're getting a boost signal using the factory sensor from the spot on the intake manifold the factory determined was the right spot to do that from. You're literally seeing the same data that the car's ECU is seeing, so that's good. It's also relatively easy to hook up the plug-and-play gauge because there's no plumbing to mess with. You don't have to figure out what factory hose am I going to cut or anything else. So it's just an easy way to do it. The only reason I didn't do it on the case of this Maserati was because it's very difficult to access the boost sensor on this particular car with this particular engine. So I just thought it would be easier to plumb it in the other way and use a non-plug-and-play boost gauge.
Other cases where you wouldn't want to do that is if you're going to run a boost value beyond what the factory sensor can read. For example, on my 124, it can boost well over 30 psi. I don't do that very often, but it can. And thus, I need a gauge that reads more than 30 psi because the factory boost sensor won't display that. In other words, even if you hooked up a 45 psi plug-and-play gauge, it wouldn't be able to actually read 45 psi because it would never receive such a signal. Looking at this picture here, you can see the mount. The tabs on the mount that they include are bendable, so you can make it stick to and conform to any shaped surface. It looks great on a black dash. On the Maserati, I'll concede that with the tan dash, the mount kind of stands out a little more than I would really like, but you don't have to use the included mount. You can certainly do other things. And the included mount does work really well. It holds the gauge well. It's universal. Looks just fine on a black dash. I'm a big fan of that particular mount. Moving along, we have the remote control. Generally, you use the remote control to set the gauge, set the warning or lighting, whatever you need to do, and forget it. But I keep the remote in the glove box, so if I need to make a change, I can. The same remote controls the entire line of Vaitrix gauges: air intake temp, coolant temp, whatever you're monitoring. So one remote controls them all. The only gauges that I'm using in my personal cars are boost gauge and intake air temp. I find those two particularly useful. The remote the gauge comes with is a pretty cool feature. It controls all the gauges. In this case, you'd press the button labeled Bravo Oscar, or BO, and that stands for boost. It tells the boost gauge you want to talk to it. And once you press that button, the rest of it is pretty self-explanatory. For example, press the brightness button, and then the up and down arrows will change the level of brightness in the gauge. Although, as I said earlier, I just use the automatic feature. It works so well, I don't put any thought into it beyond that. The other features you might want to use are, you can press the warning button, and then the up and down arrows will set the boost value. You'll see the needle move, and once it gets to the value at which you would like a warning, press enter. So now if you have your overboost set for, let's say, 20 psi, at 20 psi, you will know you're overboosting. It's very apparent with the sound and visual warnings. It's really, really nice. Other things are, if you just did a spirited drive and you think, hey, I think maybe it went to 19 psi, maybe it got kind of close to my warning. Well, you can hit peak and it'll show you what the peak boost level was on your spirited drive. That's also a pretty useful feature. Now, the water methanol injection buttons, I think they're useful. I've not personally used them, which will become clear why in just a moment. But here's how those work. Vaitrix makes a line of piggyback controllers which have a huge amount of authority and are able to tune engines. They're really, really great. And the least expensive one, the bottom one, has not only full ability to control boost in the car, but also the ability to control a two-stage water methanol injection system. In other words, it's not simply on-off, it's two-stage. It's, let's call that low and high. Now, you can use this to set the point at which spray starts, let's call that low, and then the point at which the spray goes to full, let's call that high. So if I want low spray to come on at 10 psi, I use the remote to set that on the gauge. If I want high spray to come on at 12 psi, I use that, and in conjunction with the Vaitrix booster, the most simple of their booster boxes, it will run the water methanol injection in that two-stage system, which I think is really great. The product is fantastic. It controls boost really well, and it has this two-stage water methanol feature, or just water injection, or just methanol, whatever you want to do. The reason I don't use that is because I am using the middle or sometimes higher-end Vaitrix boxes, and those are much more advanced. Instead of being limited to just two stages, they have effectively 100 stages, 0 to 100% in 1% increments, and are settable by either boost or RPM level. So I could have it start spraying at a certain RPM level and at a certain level of boost, say 5 pounds of boost at 2,000 RPM, and go up to whatever amount or back down from there. It's that full 3D mapping is just much more effective than any two-stage can be. But two-stage is a lot better than one stage, and there's a lot of value packed into that basic box, which I have on my Fiat 500L. So I think I'm going to put water methanol on my Fiat 500L primarily so that I can be more familiar with this particular feature, since I do a lot of tech support for this stuff. This picture here, which I took from the Vaitrix site, as I took a lot of these from them, I don't think they're going to mind, shows the automatic bright dim feature and gives you some idea, I guess, of how that works. Again, that works so well that I put zero thought into it and can't really explain it. I just know that it works. The lighting in that gauge always seems to match the lighting in the dashboard. It's just never a factor. I really, really, really like that feature. So that's about it. Anyway, thanks for watching, and if you're installing a boost gauge on a Maserati, even if it's not a Vaitrix one or whatever, you get stuck, go ahead and leave me a comment and I'll help you as best I can. It's not a terrible job, and it's a good thing to have in your Maserati, especially if you're going to be increasing performance. That's all. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.